I am a part of the last generation that can remember firsthand the brooding threat of global communism. I don't have many memories of specific events, but what I do remember is that it was clear that there were two very different, distinct worldviews represented on either side of the Iron Curtain. Each of these worldviews was the global manifestation of what Ronald Reagan called the age-old struggle between good and evil. Those of us in my generation may not have had a mature understanding of geopolitics, but I can say that we were acutely aware that there were enemies of freedom in this world who hated the United States and posed a very real threat to our way of life. And this was scary. Another figure from my childhood, Mr. Rogers, the creator and host of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, said on an episode that aired after I was born but far too early for me to remember, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" It was impossible to see any helpers from the vantage point of a child in the Atlanta suburbs. Those brief glimpses that we got over the Berlin Wall or around the Iron Curtain really didn't reveal much about which we could be hopeful. So it was a very welcome realization as I got older that there were helpers. There were men and women not visible on a news broadcast who spent their time outside of the spotlight and off of center stage, who were smart, cunning, and bold. They were laboring selflessly and tirelessly on behalf of all of us in pursuit of a better world and a better future. Tonight's plenary speaker, Mrs. Mary Ann Callum, is one of those helpers that we couldn't see. Mary Ann was born into Estonian parents in a refugee camp in Germany. Her parents had survived World War II just to see their homeland annexed and occupied by the Soviet Union. As the vice president of the Estonian American National Council, she lobbied one American president after the next on behalf of those trapped behind the Iron Curtain. It wasn't until 1990 that Mary Ann traveled to her parents' homeland for the very first time as a part of an almost all-female delegation of observers to the Congress of Estonia, which was a grassroots representative body elected by the Estonian people as an alternative to the Soviet Politburo. The women were granted visas because the Soviets had miscalculated and assumed that Mary Ann and her friends would be less likely to pose a threat to Soviet socialism than their male counterparts. You'll see how ridiculous that is momentarily. At the Congress of Estonia, she met and then later married the speaker, Tunne Kelam, another hero of the Estonian freedom movement, who today serves as a member of the European Parliament. She has served herself as a spokeswoman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the nation of Estonia and then later as a member of the parliament of that nation. Most importantly, however, she is the mother of 2 and grandmother of 5. She's led a very interesting life and has graciously agreed to share with us some of the wisdom that she's gleaned from it. Please join me in welcoming my friend and the formidable foe to all who oppose freedom, Mrs. Mary Ann Callum, to the Acton University stage.
Thank you very much, Trey, for that lovely introduction. I hardly recognized myself. But I did want to make one quick correction before I start on my speech. It was not an all-female delegation. It was just that the females seemed to be more likely to get the visas. We had men, too. And I am struggling with a bit of a cold and a voice, and I hope you'll forgive me. But ladies and gentlemen, believers, fighters for freedom and justice, I am so proud and happy to be here, to have been invited to speak at this wonderful occasion. It may sound like a cliche, But believe me, it is wonderful to be with people who are like-minded. We may have small disagreements on this and that, but we agree on the basics, and the basics are love God and love thy fellow man. If you do that, it all will fall into place, because loving God means that you cannot be cruel or horrible or disparaging or even killing other people because of their beliefs or any worldviews. And this was pointed out to me by a cab driver in Washington, D.C., as my husband and I were heading to the National Prayer Breakfast as foreign guests of the National Prayer Breakfast, because it took me moving to Estonia before I was ever invited to participate, and then coming back. But the cab driver happened to be Muslim, and he asked us where we were going, and I told him, and he said, you know, that is a very good basis, he said, to center around the figure of Jesus. And he said, the 2 commandments that I just said to you, that the world would not have the problems that it has if everyone would just obey those 2 commandments of love God with all thy heart and all thy soul, and love thy fellow man as thyself. Problem solved. Unfortunately, of course, we know it's not quite like that. The last time I spoke to such a group as large as this and as eagerly awaiting my golden words was when I was 16 years old. In Columbus, Ohio, I was a delegate to Buckeye Girl State. And at the end of the conference, we had a big rally, which we called the anti-communism rally. Can you believe that? In 1963, it was still possible to have an anti-communism rally. I was the main speaker, and it was quite an experience. But since then, I have not had a group quite this large, though I've done much speaking in my time. But enough of this background, except for the first little message I want to give is that partly we would not be in the trouble that we're in the world today if we had had a proper assessment and a moral judgment universally of the crimes of communism, just as we did for the crimes of Nazism and fascism. If we had had that, it's still possible, we would not have a former KGB, and there's no former KGB person as president of an autocratic, kleptocratic, aggressive Russia today. The problem would have been solved. He would have never become president, because just as you cannot imagine some former Nazi general being the Chancellor of Germany today, the same kind of attitude would have been for Russia. And I'm backed up in this theory by, excuse me, the former advisor to President Yeltsin, Alexander Yakovlev, who wrote in his book, A Century of Violence in Soviet Russia, that Russia will never be a normal country until it acknowledges the terrible things that have been done as communist Russia. So, facts are there. But back to the beginning. You've heard part of it, kind of a snapshot of who I am and where I come from. My parents were among the very last to leave Estonia ahead of the Soviet invasion, the second Soviet invasion of Estonia in September of 1944. They got on a ship to go to Germany. My father had been working for a company that had its headquarters in Germany, and so he was able to take his family on the ship. My mother, my father, and my father's mother were the ones getting on the ship. My mother's mother was left on the dock waving goodbye and saying she would come on the next ship. She could have probably gotten on, as my mother said, because there was such confusion there at the dock, people running, jumping, screaming, people hauling their suitcases up onto the ship with ropes. It was a great scene of disorder, and she could have joined them, but she said, no, I'll come on the next ship. And so then my parents proceeded on to go through war-torn Europe. They were in Czechoslovakia and various places in Germany until they finally, fortunately, ended up in the American zone of occupied Germany. And I say fortunately because really the circumstances in that part of Germany were better than under the French rule or the UK rule, or of course under Soviet rule. It was a stressful time, nevertheless. People didn't feel quite safe. Russian agents were scouring the camps trying to get people to return to their native lands, which were now under Soviet domination, saying, oh, it'll be fine, there'll be no problems, we'll welcome you back. And some of the administrators and people working in these camps from the Western side, from the UNRRA, the UN Relief Organization, and other such, were rather naive and perhaps hypocritical. They didn't know what to do with this vast number of refugees, people who had voted with their feet, who had left because of dire circumstances, and really did want them just to go back home and eliminate the problem. And then there were the other ones, the ones who understood what communism meant, what it meant for people to have to go back to jail, to death, torture, whatever would be awaiting them. And one of these people was a man who will forever, that I've never met him, I don't even know his first name, but forever in our family he will be a hero. It was a Captain Watts in the U.S. Army who took a group of Estonian refugees under his wing when they were being threatened by Russians to be deported back to Soviet-occupied Estonia. And he said, these people are under my personal protection, and you will get them over my dead body. I don't know who he was, but this is so typically American, and in our family we always spoke very, very reverently. So I grew up in a family who respected freedom, loved God, and who made no bones about telling me these values of life. I was raised to be thrifty, not to waste, not to lie, not to cheat, and to love nature. It was something that was very close to our hearts. So I had a very good upbringing. I also learned the Estonian language at my mother's knee. I never went to Estonian school, so my grammar is a little shaky, but my vocabulary and my speaking ability is quite good. And I had a defining moment in my life in 1956. Can you guess? The Hungarian Revolution? People fighting for freedom against communism, and the world watching and saying, oh dear, oh dear. And President Eisenhower, unfortunately, was very tired of war, understandably, and sent them peas, dried peas, and corn, but no help. And so the revolution was put down. But for me, this was so incredible. We were glued to the radio. We never had a television in my house until I went to college. We were glued to the radio, listening to every development, praying and hoping that this would be the event that would bring down communism all over Europe and turn it back, and that all these countries would be free as they were hoping to be free. But it didn't happen. As a result, about 2 years later, as a 12-year-old, I wrote a letter to the Cleveland Plain Dealer in response to an article that was critical of the Hungarian freedom fighters. I took umbrage at this. These were heroes. I had learned from these people that there are things that are worth dying for. And I wrote a letter to the editor. It was quite good. It didn't get published, but my mother saved everything I ever did, so I found it just recently. And it was nice to read. I thought I wasn't embarrassed. As time went on, I went to college and had my first experience with the left. I was a rather naive, small-town Ohio girl at that point. And when I encountered people at school who thought it was better to live peaceably with Soviets, not to worry about communism, when we would have big arguments about whether it was better to be dead or red or dead, and I had no chance really to present any of my arguments because I was ganged up on. They were all yelling at me and shouting and not wanting to hear what I had to say. Sounds a little bit like what we're having today, doesn't it? Conservative speakers not welcome on college campuses. But I was at a school that was already then liberal, and I had a good taste of what it's become like at many schools now. I was able to learn English because the farm, when my parents ended up, you had to have a sponsor, you had to be screened, you had to have a job to come to America back then. And it was, again, thanks to a Democrat president, Harry Truman, that the doors were opened for more refugees to come to the United States as a result of the displacements of World War II. I had learned the English on a farm when I was 4 years old. This is when we had crossed the ocean on an old American troop ship, landed in New York, took the train to Ohio, where my parents' job was. And fortunately, there was a little 4-year-old girl there who became my playmate and my English teacher, though I have no memory of learning English. I wish I did. It's a fascinating process. But by the time I went to first grade, it was my best subject, and I had no trouble verbalizing or spelling or reading or doing any of those very necessary things. And then, of course, going on to college. But later, after college, moved to the Washington, D.C. area, first at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and then in Alexandria and Arlington. And of course, this location made it ideal for lobbying Congress, lobbying anybody that would listen, having access to leaders and trying to get the message out about Estonia and all the other captive nations still waiting to be freed. The first demonstration I participated in was not until I was in the Washington, D.C. area, and we picketed at the Australian embassy. Now you may ask why. That was because they had had a Labor left takeover of the government. Not takeover, they were elected duly, excuse me. And they were about to change the status of a very important international policy that the Americans were the first to promulgate. This is what we call the non-recognition policy, which means that you do not recognize the takeover of another nation's territory by force. It's illegal. And the Americans came out with this policy way back when the Soviets first took over the Baltic states. And it was something that this large nation was able to hold on to for over 50 years of Soviet domination of so much of Europe to its happy conclusion when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania restored their freedom. Americans did the right thing from the start, and despite a lot of scary moments where we were worried that policy would change, Americans stuck by that policy and were the most instrumental in helping us to re-achieve our independence. So really, The basic thanks go to God, of course, and to the American people, to the American administrations, and particularly Ronald Reagan, for having brought about this change in the world. But it still didn't do away with communism. We had many threats to the non-recognition policy, and there were times when Henry Kissinger wanted to encourage détente. President Ford stood up to him and said, no, we're going to continue with what we're doing, and there's a Ford Museum right here in the city where we are. I intend to visit it if there's some spare time. As I progressed in my lobbying and demonstrating and organizing events, giving interviews, writing letters to the editor, I started getting visitors from Estonia, people who were involved in trying to bring back freedom to Estonia. I had several of them. They were all excellent people. Some had been former political prisoners in the Gulag. Others were just active people. But things were easing up a little bit at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, and people could get exit visas. And at that point, I met my future husband, my second husband, Tunne Kelam, who was referred to in Trey's remarks. He came to the United States to meet with people and to explain about the Congress of Estonia, which was a very unique body. It was based on, again, the non-recognition policy, whereby all of the people living in Estonia who had had Estonian citizenship before the occupation were eligible, and their descendants were eligible to register as Estonian citizens. This resulted in 900,000 people registering out of a country of 1.5 million, and many of the 500,000 extra were occupants or people who had come to resettle Estonia. So 900,000 people said, we are not Soviet citizens. We are holding Soviet passports, and not exit passports, but just domestic passports. But we are really Estonian citizens. The Estonian Republic for us is still alive. It may be under occupation de facto, but de jure, it is a free nation and still exists, not absorbed and disappeared into the Soviet Union. The Congress, the people who registered, were then able to elect delegates to a Congress of Estonia. We also elected people from the United States and other countries where there were Estonian emigres and refugees. I was one of the delegates, and my husband, Tunne Kelam, was elected the chairman of the Congress of Estonia. So it was quite an honor to be there. In those years when I was doing lobbying in Congress and explaining about the Congress of Estonia, working for political prisoners, a la the Amnesty International kind of events, I was happy to have bipartisan support from the Congress. The Reagan administration itself was fantastic. They were very supportive and did many things to promote this idea that the occupation is illegal and that it should end. And it wasn't all just limited to words, as nowadays we hear more words and fewer deeds. But in the Congress, Democrats and Republicans were on our side. These people could understand the analogy of what freedom means based on what America had enjoyed all those years and on the values on which it was based and founded. They remembered the founding fathers, people like Abraham Lincoln, the wonderful things that had been said. They had studied these things in school. And so naturally, even though their politics might be Democrat, they would still share these common American and religious values. So my message got across. But it changed, it got worse. And by 1991, we had a different president. And then we had the Iraq War, the situation with Kuwait. And for us, for the Baltics, it was a very scary time because it felt as if we may be lost in the shuffle and that the Russians would see an advantage. Americans are busy in Iraq. We can just crack down even harder on these Baltic states that are trying to become free. Trey tells me I should tell this story, so I will. In January of 1991, things came to a head with the crushing with tanks of many dissidents and people protesting the Soviet occupation in Lithuania. And this brought about somewhat of a reaction, even in the Bush White House, but not enough. Not enough. And so at one point, we were invited, a small group of us Baltic leaders who were representing organizations. I was not doing this alone. There were many, many Baltic organizations in the United States, from the Joint Baltic American National Committee to the Baltic American Freedom League, to all of the individual countries having their own Estonian American National Council and that kind of thing. And I see a friend who was involved in this too, a good Estonian from Ohio, is sitting here. But in any case, a small group of us were invited to the White House to meet with Brent Scowcroft, who was then the head of the National Security Council. And we went expecting not much, but hoping for the best. And when we heard Brent Scowcroft tell us things like, well, after we had presented a list of sanctions and other things that they could do against the Soviets, he would say things to us like, anything we can do to the Soviet Union would be but a pinprick and would just make the bear more angry. We were starting to feel embarrassed to be Americans. This was horrible to hear this from the head of the National Security Council. And my friend Asta and I, she's a rabid Lithuanian American, and I were sort of shifting in our seats and thinking, how can we make our excuses to leave, because there's no point in our wasting our time here. Into this room where we were sitting walks the president, George Bush. And if I remember correctly, he said, well, well, whom have we here? Now, I don't think the president goes wandering around the White House just opening doors at random and seeing who's there. This was a rather cleverly planned bit of little PR to appease these Baltic leaders. And so then he asked us why we were there and sat down and we began to talk. And in my remarks to George Bush, I used the word appeasement. Now, I think I said it only once or twice. My friend Asta tells me I said it 3 times. This was something that was very much in the news those days, and he was getting a lot of criticism. He was getting rather upset. And to hear this snippety woman saying appeasement right there in the White House must have been too much, because he got very angry. He stood up and he said, "Don't use that word." Well, there was a scary moment. I've just made the President of the United States angry. What do I do now? So then I went on, of course, talking and saying, well, Mr. President, I didn't mean that you are actually appeasing, but the things the United States is doing are looking to the Russians as if it's appeasement. They're interpreting these things that way. And the lack of action is definitely heading in that direction. And somehow he got calmed down and he stayed for the rest of the meeting, which lasted for another hour, which shows you that we were quite effective. Make sure I don't miss anything important. And the trouble is that the kind of attitude that we were having then trying to get by with taking easy measures against gross violations of human rights, gross violations of international law. We're actually seeing this still today in 2019. Not so much from the United States, though there are some in Congress that are taking this attitude, but we're seeing this attitude toward the Russian incursion into Ukraine, the arresting of Ukrainian ships, taking Ukrainian sailors and poets and politicians and journalists hostage and holding them in terrible Russian jails. The Europeans, unfortunately, are really the most at fault at saying a lot of nice words, but doing the wrong deeds, not even not doing deeds, but doing the wrong deeds. Mrs. Merkel just had a meeting with the new president of Ukraine. She is the Chancellor of Germany, as you would know. And while she said nice things to him, that, oh yes, Ukraine should be free and we don't like Russian interference, all that kind of thing. On the other hand, the German government just signed an economic agreement with Russia a few days ago in St. Petersburg, whereby Russians are going to get German engineers coming to help them develop their country. And she is also pushing very hard for the Gazprom pipeline. Very bad thing, which will bypass Ukraine and which will give huge benefits to Russia. So these words mean very little when you're doing those kinds of deeds on the side. It seems that without America, we would really be in trouble in this world. Really be in trouble. And why is it that America still is our last best hope? Our history, the founding fathers. There's the Abraham Lincoln, whom I didn't realize said quite as wonderful things as he has said, but he described America very beautifully in some of his remarks and speeches. I'd like to read you just quickly a short quotation. Our reliance is in the love of liberty which God has planted in our bosoms. Our defense is in the preservation of the spirit which prized liberty as the heritage of all men, in all lands, everywhere. This echoes, or Václav Havel echoed these same words when he said, "For your freedom and ours." Until all of us are free, none of us are really free. And then later, he went on, "Destroy this spirit, and you have planted the seeds of despotism around your own doors. Familiarize yourselves with the chains of bondage, and you are preparing your own limbs to wear them." And another wonderful thing that Abraham Lincoln reminded people back in 1863 about is, we have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, but we have forgotten God, and have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, remember this is 1863, but it applies to today, doesn't it? Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. This was Lincoln's proclamation of a national fast day, March 30th, 1863. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with a few bits of advice. I know I've skipped around, given you a lot of information that's not complete. A lot of details are confusing. I could talk for several hours here, but I know that you have other things to do. But the few bits of advice that I would like to share with you are what I started with. Love God, love thy fellow man. If you get that right, everything else will follow. But, just in case, never lie. The truth is what will set you free. And this is what happened in our first big protest in Estonia against Soviet Empire. The first protest took place in 1987 with the threat of tanks being sent in to crush this protest. Nobody had done this for years and years and years. Here's where we worked again together with our friends and colleagues in the occupied countries to make sure that the world media knew that this event was coming up, and therefore it did get coverage. And so when I was opening the Roanoke Times, or News, I think, on the next day, August 24th, 1987, there was an article about Baltic demonstration. It was so important to have it not only there, but also in the free world. But as far as lying, a lie may seem to be expedient. Little white lie, so what? But it always harms another. If not some particular person, still it harms mankind. In general, mankind, for it vitiates the source of the law itself. Dishonesty, and this I think applies also to hypocrisy. Dishonesty contributes to the further erosion of communities, because without honesty there can be no confidence in legal contracts, no shared confidence in social arrangements, no authority for the rule of law, which is so fundamental. Remember also, here's a final point, appeasement never works. It only strengthens the bullies. And we are seeing too much appeasement nowadays. Terrible things are happening in the world. And if we had had the courage to condemn the crimes of communism then, or even now, generally, morally, completely, we might have a completely different Russia today. A Russia that is democratic and willing to be our ally in solving the huge problems facing this world. But instead we have Russia under Putin that is helping to make new and more problems and is working with dictators of all kinds. As Mark Twain said, always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest. I thank you for your attention.
So remember, we'll use the Slido app to ask questions. They'll be fed to me. But before we get to that, I have one question for you. Can you tell us the story of the Freedom for Estonia button that you're wearing?
It probably was covered by my little cape here, but the button says just 3 words: Freedom for Estonia. And this was a genius little button that was created by a friend of mine in Baltimore who made it simple. And as soon as I saw this button, I said, that's the one we need to use it everywhere. And we would just pass these out to all of our fellow Estonians as much as we could. And one time when I and another couple of women were walking the halls of Congress, you know how big the building is and how many offices, we were gathering signatures on behalf of a political prisoner. A lady stopped me in the elevator and said, "Freedom for Estonia. What is that? We're seeing it everywhere." And it just shows you, you have to have a clear message, you have to be sincere about it, not hide it. I wore this button every day, no matter if I was wearing jeans or a ball gown, because it was so important.
So there's another story that goes with this button that I think you're okay to tell. It happened when Estonia joined NATO in Vilnius.
Yes.
Do you mind telling that?
Not at all. I hope no one gets offended, but this is how it happened. In Estonia, we have our own weird little politics too, and people jockeying for position, and we're not all Democrats and yay, yay, yay. A friend of mine, Paul Goebel, always said, fighting for freedom is easy, but building democracy is really hard. That's true. But I was not made part of the delegation that was to go to Vilnius when George Bush was, the first George Bush was, or I mean the second, the son, was to be there to welcome the Baltic states into NATO. Well, one of the administrators found out, "Mary Ann, you have to be part of this delegation." So I got into the delegation, went to Vilnius, and of course it was very useful having me there as an American. And we all had to line up for a group shot with the president after he'd made his remarks, and people were jockeying for position. There were all sorts of people there, about 100 or more. I stood there for the first couple of pictures, and I thought, I have better things to do. So I slipped off the podium, walked over to Laura Bush and spoke to her. And I handed her a copy of my husband's book, and we chatted. And then as I'm talking to her, I noticed the crowd had left. No one else was there except for her husband, George Bush. Now, I always liked George Bush, the son. For me, he had much bigger heart. But in any case, so I went up to him and I spoke to him and wished him a happy Thanksgiving. And he said yes, that he'll be spending it with his father. And so I took off the pin that I had and I gave it to George Bush. And I said, "Give this to your father with greetings from Mary Ann." Poor George had no idea. But George lived a long time after that, so that event he was able to survive. But you see what you can do if you use the moment and you jump in and you aren't afraid.
All right. So now we've got questions that are coming from the audience here. The first one is global communism still a threat, both in the USA and abroad?
I agree wholeheartedly. It's still a threat. I think it's a creeping threat. Communism is like a cancer, and the cells have spread widely. And there are many, many apologists for communism who keep saying that, oh, the communism we've seen so far hasn't been the real thing, or all these arguments where it could be better. Because on paper, if you look at it, it sounds pretty nice, you know, equality and whatever, but it's one of those typical things that you cannot legislate the whole population to be happy. And when Gorbachev gave an interview to the New York Times in 1999, he said, well, communism was not really so bad. All we wanted was for people to be happy. If you're not happy, bang.
How is religious faith a part of the fight for freedom in the Baltic countries?
I'll speak more for Estonia because it's the same pretty much in the others, but I have the direct personal experience. The first real opposition party in the whole Soviet Union was founded in a church. It was the Estonian National Independence Party. We called ourselves a party And this was way back when it was still the beginnings of glasnost and perestroika. Many of our events took place in churches. They were safer. They were the base of our helpers and our members. And we began every event with a prayer and ended every event with a prayer. So it was very, very important. As time goes on, these things become less important. And it's, as Abraham Lincoln said, we have forgotten.
Is there any imminent danger of Eastern and Central Europe sliding back into socialism, forced or otherwise? It's an ongoing danger as long as there is an aggressive Russia run by the KGB or FSB, whatever you want to call it now. They interfere, they meddle, they influence people, they have a lot of money. I don't know where Putin has gotten all that money, except he's stolen it from the Russian people. He's supposed to be one of the richest people in the world, so that's a lot of money to buy people. Like he bought Gerhard Schröder, who is now the head of Gazprom, the former chancellor of Germany. But it goes on a lower level, a higher level. They're agents of influence. It is an incredible network. And it harkens back to something that Stalin said in a speech to the Politburo on August 19th, 1939. You may know this date, 1939, August 23rd, was the signing of the non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. And Stalin gave a speech just before that explaining to his fellow communists why he was about to do this. And his reasons were, this way, if we have non-aggression with Germany, Germany will fight France and the UK, they'll all wear each other out. Meanwhile, we will be making propaganda in all these European nations. And by the end of the war, when we hope it lasts a long time, he even said this in the speech, we will be able to spread world communism. So that kind of thinking still goes on. I mean, it's in writing. The speech has been reproduced in the West. If you talk about Hitler and his Mein Kampf that no one paid attention to much, his plan of action. This was Stalin's plan of action, spelled out. Be allies with Nazi Germany until it's time to take over the world. Nice. So from David, a Brexit-supporting Brit, so not David Cameron. How does Estonia's membership of the EU impact the freedom of Estonians? Will it get worse or better in the future?
Oh, I don't think there's really an impact on freedom in the sense of what we can do, since so much of the decision-making is still made on the national level. It's not as if Brussels is issuing orders and controlling everything. There is a certain moral pressure that comes from the European Parliament at times, which is quite useful for those of us who are still fighting the communist and leftist agenda. But the EU has only been good for the Baltic states, and I'm very sad about Brexit, actually. I can see some reasons for it, but I'm very sad because anything that threatens the unity of Europe is only good for those who want to make trouble.
That is not David applauding.
Sorry, David.
Can you please describe the situation of young Estonians? Have they learned the lessons of the evils of communism?
Mm-hmm. These are very good questions, folks. The young Estonians are enjoying freedom a great deal. They love the opportunity to travel, to study at foreign universities, to make up for everything that their parents and grandparents missed. Unfortunately, I and some others fear that they have either not known or have forgotten what it was like to live under a Soviet regime, which is why I wrote my book. It's in Estonian. I'm still working on the English version. But I wrote my book to help educate my fellow Estonians as to, first of all, how we fought for freedom in the West to help Estonians, and secondly, how bad things were and how bad that could have been. I think people don't know. The parents who sort of wanted to just forget all that horror and never shared it with their children, and just the temptations of modern life. It's, you see it everywhere among the youth.
Love God, love your neighbor, tell the truth. Appeasement only strengthens bullies. Thank you, well said. How do we, the U.S. as a nation, get to that position? Solve all of our problems tonight.
Yeah. No,
Here we go. 10 minutes.
We all have, 10 minutes. Oh, that's good. Oh, I can do it faster. No, we all have free will, and we are all capable of making choices. This is something we forget. We have a choice every day as to how to spend our time. Are we going to be on our computers or social media or just playing games or fooling around or whatever? Or are we going to do something serious for at least part of the day? We need to make that personal choice to become more informed about the world, to read more books. I can give you a list of wonderful books that will help, and you obviously have a nice bookstore out here that will help. I think all of you are probably rather well informed, but other people who don't read, it's almost as if the invention of television was an invidious plot to get us all to stop reading and to just watch television and have this intruder in our houses 24 hours a day. That's part of the problem. Now the social media has redoubled it. Hear more applause? Yes. This is why I'm so normal. My parents didn't own a television until I went to college, you see. But to be informed and to pay attention and to speak to other people about the things you've learned. Study the Founding Fathers and what they did. Read the books about the Constitutional Convention that was held in Philadelphia. There's a wonderful book called Miracle at Philadelphia. It was an incredible battle to get this wonderful constitution that we have. Think about the Revolutionary War, the heroes of that. For me, being part of the Estonian Revolution, in a sense, which we sometimes call singing revolution, though it was much more than that, for me it was like reliving something that I'd never lived, the American Revolution. We had our Tom Jeffersons and Patrick Henrys, and we even had an Adams. Our Uri Adams was the man who drafted our new Constitution when we became independent, so Adams even connects by name. But those kinds of experiences that people have to share with you, then you share them with others and try to work on getting the education system in this country improved. It has really, really degenerated from my day. Get on school boards.
Why do you think that communism is still alive?
Because it was never condemned. It was always given a free pass, a sort of look through the fingers, don't really look at how horrible it was. Well, that happened back then. And you know what this has led to? It has led to 70% of Russians now thinking that Stalin was a good, if not great guy. Stalin, the butcher of millions. The latest poll in Russia exposed this kind of thinking. And if people are thinking like this, that means they have no idea about what it is. Be happy or else.
In a culture that is seemingly stifling free speech and truly open dialogue, what are some creative ways we can effectively approach resistance to communism?
That's the hard one. Well, read, prepare your arguments, be eloquent, be not afraid. The Bible says that cowardice is one of the great sins. I think that's true. And I think false modesty is another sin, because if you have something to share, don't be, oh, why should I share this? You know, do it. Say it. Don't be afraid. do more praying and ask for God's help. So we go back to what Abraham Lincoln was recommending and the other founding fathers.
So your personal experience has ended positively, but even tonight you've met some of our participants from Venezuela. What would be your advice to others who have suffered and are now crushed?
First of all is do not lose hope. Keep struggling. The choice each of us makes to continue the fight is important. It's like for want of a shoe, the horse is lost. For want of a horse, the soldier is lost. And finally, the war is lost. You don't know when you personally might be that important person who will be the trigger that will make the change, when you will have an opportunity to speak to someone or make a point somewhere. You need to keep working and count on the rest of us who are trying to inform our governments to pay attention and to do real things to support you. It's not a very good answer, I know, because it's very, very hard, and I'd love to read you Ronald Reagan's letter at the very end, if I may, which would...
I was actually going to ask if you would.
Okay.
So we have time for one more question before that letter, but it happens to be a long and complicated question. So, traditionalists appreciate Putin's defense of Christian morals, especially against the onslaught of sexual immorality. Is it real, or should we be skeptical?
It's not a long and complicated question at all. Remember, communists will do anything to achieve their ends. They will lie, cheat, steal, and pretend to be believers. I am sorry. I do not believe that Putin is a real believer or that those things that he is doing are out of the right motives. It's somewhat popular with certain groups, but he controls the Russian Orthodox Church. They will not allow, for instance, the Ukrainian church to separate and be its own church free of Moscow's domination. I mean, it has happened, but they keep saying, we want them back, this is not right. Who are these upstarts that they would have their own separate church with their own archbishop? It sounds good sometimes. Yeah, he's on the right side. But he is a communist. He's a KGB person. They never change. They never change. You can wear a cross around your neck and pretend to be something that you're not. And you can manipulate and you can lie, but God knows. And God will eventually show what is right.
All right, well.
Can I read it?
Please, please.
In the course of my lobbying efforts and organizing demonstrations and picketing, and we've had so many adventures. When I finally get my book done, you can read it all yourselves. But there were discouraging times. One of the highlights of that period was 1983, when I had my first letter to the editor published in the Washington Post. I was very excited. Some other very good meetings and things took place. I met nice, useful people. And I wrote a letter to President Reagan thanking him for organizing a reception at the White House for the signing of the Baltic Freedom Day Declaration. This was the second one. The first one was in '82, but this one was special because it was accompanied with a reception with a lot of us who had worked to get this resolution through Congress. Baltic Freedom Day itself is a positive word in the sense that it is June 14th, the day when tens of thousands of Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and other people were taken from their homes, often in the middle of the night, loaded onto cattle cars, and shipped off to Siberia for no reason at all, without any trial. This was followed by another deportation when it was not even wartime in 1949, which even the European Parliament has condemned as a totally unnecessary deportation. But he had organized this reception, and yet, there were days where it was really hard, like we're not getting our message across, no one's listening, my letters aren't being published, people aren't paying attention. Even sometimes among our own community, you would have people that would not be working as actively as they might. I mean, all those things we did, folk dancing and everything else, were nice, but we needed to do the political things as well. And so I went out to the mailbox after I'd sent Ronald Reagan a thank you letter, a week or so later, in a little green envelope, pale green envelope, small in size. Usually White House invitations were the legal-sized white envelopes, White House. My hands were already shaking. What is this? And I opened it to find this wonderful letter that I will treasure for the rest of my life. If I can get through reading it without breaking down in tears or getting a lump in my throat, please hope for me. September 6, 1983, dear Mrs. Ricken, I was deeply touched by your letter. You exemplify one of the deepest reasons why America has succeeded as a nation. People came here from every land under the sun, and they discovered a country which enabled them to prosper, but which inspired their loyalty, and yet never asked them to renounce their own sense of cultural identity and ethnicity. On the contrary, the fabric of American life is like a rich tapestry woven from many strands of different textures and colors, unified by a common respect for our free institutions based on the dignity of every person as a child of God. Too often, sadly, we Americans take our freedom for granted like the air we breathe. We do not see the danger from predatory empires that fear freedom and hate God. You can perform a real service to our country by continuing to alert your fellow Americans about the dangers we face. We must remain strong and vigilant, but government can only do so much. We need a national consensus in support of sound policies. I want to thank you for doing your part. Do not become discouraged. Continue to pray for your ancestral homeland and for your adopted land. I join you in those prayers. God bless you. Sincerely, Ronald Reagan. And as a postscript to this letter, I wanted to say that I think he was writing to my mother as well. As a refugee from Soviet communism who thought she would never see her mother again, left her on the dock, you remember, in Estonia, and thought she'd gone down with one of the ships that the Soviets had bombed. After Stalin died, my mother got a letter from her mother in 1954. She had not known for 10 years whether her mother was alive, and her mother didn't know that I had been born in this German refugee camp. And my mother was a courageous woman. She spoke at every occasion where she was invited, at Rotary Club, Moose Club, in churches, wherever, with her school English, which of course is not the same as when you've learned it just as a native tongue. She was very brave, and she was my best helper. So she helped all the way to the end.
Thank you, Mary Ann. You've honored us with your presence.